Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hello and welcome to the first great debate of EGU 2019. Thank you very much for coming. It's entitled Science in Policymaking, Who is Responsible? So this session aims to discuss the role of science in policymaking, to discuss both sides of the arguments about who is responsible to ensure evidence-based policymaking and how policy should be informed by science. So, for example, on one side, is it the responsibility of the scientists to ensure their research is heard by policymakers? Should they be the ones making the effort to contact policymakers and communicate their research to wider audiences? I mean, after all, lots of earth science research is nationally or EU funded, and there are institutional processes that exist to get scientists involved in the policy process. Shouldn't researchers be giving something back to their funders? But on the other hand, shouldn't this be the responsibility that lies within the policymakers? As so much is already expected from academics as it is, time spent communicating to policymakers could actually be better spent writing grants, publishing papers, teaching their students, maybe for their own personal careers at least. Is it the responsibility of policymakers? It is the responsibility of policymakers to create effective policies. So shouldn't they be the ones actively seeking advice from scientists? And so to do this, shouldn't they be putting in place more mechanisms to get information from the scientists? So my name is Sarah Connors, and I work at the Technical Support Unit for the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 1. Part of my job involves working with climate scientists to create reports that cover policy-relevant content and can inform international negotiations. The IPCC reports themselves are drafted by scientists, but their summaries are co-produced with policymakers, going through a line-by-line approval process with government representatives from 195 different countries. I therefore consider myself working at one of the interfaces between science and policy, and I'm going to be the facilitator for this session. So together with Chloe Hill, who's sitting at the front, she's the EGU's Science Policy Officer, we have put together this great debate as we felt, well, now more than ever, it's important to discuss science's role in policymaking. We really have an excellent panel here today. I'm very proud of the panel we've managed to put together. They've been invited to begin by giving short presentations of no more than 10 minutes on their particular views in this debate. And then after the presentations, we're going to have a short panel discussion, followed by opening that up to questions from the floor so we can have a more whole room-wide discussion. But before I introduce our panelists, I would like to ask everyone in the audience to actually get out their phones. Can you please get out your mobile phones? And can you go to the website? So, you can see a website on the screen now. So panelists, if you've got your phones, please can you also do this? There's free Wi-Fi here, so you have no excuse. Can you please go to the website menti.com, that's www.menti.com, and you'll be asked to add a code, and the code is there, it's 321670. Can we show the website? Thank you. So there's two questions here that I'm going to ask you to answer. And we're going to repeat these questions at the end as well, to see what the kind of view in the audience is at the beginning and to see if it changes by the end. So the first question is, who is responsible for ensuring science in policymaking? Scientists, policymakers, or you don't know? Oh, the code, sorry, is 321670. Okay, so it's reasonably close, I guess, but more policymakers. So this will be interesting to see in the speeches that we get. Okay. And then the next question we have, what are the barriers for scientists to contribute to policy? To make it easier, I made it multiple choice. So we've got lack of mechanisms of how to get involved. People don't think there's a benefit or a gain. People don't have the time to get involved with policy. Or you think it's too risky. Or any other. Is it not working? Can you not go on to the next?
Enable cookies. Please wait for the presenter to show the next slide.
Chloe, I think you might have to... Oh, yeah.
Scientists and policymakers to work together with websites is harder. Otherwise, we have to do it with handwriting.
Chloe, any ideas? Okay. So the presenter has to refresh. I'm not the presenter. Okay, well, maybe we can get that one fixed by the end of the session. But at least we got a good introduction to who are responsible. Okay. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to start introducing the speakers. I'll introduce them one at a time. And just to remind you that we're going to take questions right at the end. So if you have questions for a particular speaker, can you write them down and save them for the discussion at the end? Okay, so introducing our first speaker, we have Paul Watkinson. So Paul has been working on climate change and sustainable development issues for more than 20 years. For much of that time as a chief negotiator and head of the climate negotiations team for the French Ministry of Ecological and Solidary Transition, as well as councillor to the director for European and International Affairs of the same ministry. He was elected chair of the subsidiary body for science and technology advice, also known as SUBSTA, which is part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. An experienced international negotiator, Paul has a detailed knowledge of the negotiating mechanisms, the key actors, and the workings of the UN Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. So I'd like to welcome Paul to the stage to give his words. Thank you.
Is that going to count down?
I can tell.
Okay, I'll do a turn on my thing. Okay, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to come and discuss with you today in this debate this morning. Yes, as you said, I'm coming from the policy-making side, so I, of course, voted that it's scientists' responsibility to get the message over. I felt there were too few of us in the room to make that message. But I actually don't like binary questions, because I think it's clearly a joint responsibility, and more generally with the civil society as well, we need to be thinking. Now, I've been working for quite a long time now on issues of climate policy. And this is an area where I think the interaction between the scientific community and the policy community has been a permanent dialogue ever since we created the IPCC, in particular back in 1988, even before when the debate was beginning. And the work especially of the IPCC has been critical throughout that time in taking the enormous scientific effort which has been undertaken and providing us with an overview of that information, although individual scientists, individual studies have of course fed in hugely to our work. And the creation of the Climate Convention back in 1992 followed very much the messages provided by the scientific community. And when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement 3 years ago, 4 years ago almost now, the work of the scientific community, the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, initiatives such as the Our Common Future Under Climate Change that the French scientific community organized in Paris that year, were critical in helping us frame and provide that debate. And my own role as chair of SUBSTA, the subsidiary body of scientific and technological advice of the Climate Convention last year and this year, takes me into the areas of negotiation far too much, but the heart of it is the interface between the scientific and the policy community, and the opportunity to organize that dialogue between us, for me, is vital. Of course, it is very difficult in any field, but I think even more so in the climate field, to simply take the output of the scientific community, particularly the physical sciences, which is giving us very clear information on the impacts that our actions, our emissions are having on our planet and therefore on ourselves, to take that information and simply translate it into policies. It's one thing to say that we need to keep warming well under 2 degrees or limit it at 1.5 degrees. It's very hard to then say, what does that mean for our energy systems, our transport systems, our cities, our agriculture, and actually translate that directly into policy choices. And I think this dialogue is the one which is particularly critical, how we take the information we're given and how we can use it. It's not a straightforward one. It's clearly a to and a froing which is essential, and the way in which we can organize that is what interests me a lot. There was an interesting exchange a few days ago on Twitter, which I noticed, which I found fascinating, saying that politicians don't read scientific literature, which I think is true. And I don't think we should necessarily criticize people for not going out and reading all the scientific papers in depth. People don't have the time to do that. Criticism that senior officials don't read them either. Well, I think some of us try to, although even then there are limits to our ability to give our time to reading everything directly. But I think the way in which we can structure that dialogue, the amount of time we spend dialoguing with the scientific community, organizing meetings, discussing directly through conferences, but also through individual meetings, that dialogue is something we can structure better. Again, within the SUBSTA, I try to ensure that we have that space and that we can be a genuine dialogue between policymakers and the scientific community. It's not always easy. Sometimes when we bring very good scientists together, they talk amongst themselves rather than the policy community trying to really dialogue with you. And it's trying to go beyond that, which is a challenge. But I think there's another area here, which is sometimes it's the language we need to face. I think it's vital that the scientific community, particularly the physical sciences, can communicate very clearly and rigorously the findings that you've been working on and that you've been developing. But the policy community is much happier getting into debate around wording. It's the legal side. And where we do get into many of our policy choices, it's the language of economics. Which determines what we do and what we don't do. And sometimes there's a disconnect there between those different languages which we need to be able to use. A couple of examples. When I was chairing the last meeting of the SUBSTA in Katowice at the end of 2018, we had a very unfortunate, for me very disappointing debate on how we should react to the special report produced by the IPCC on global warming of 1.5 degrees. An extraordinary piece of work done in very short time by the scientific community to react to a specific request that we as policymakers had made to the scientific community to give us that understanding of what 1.5 degrees meant. And we got into a rather silly debate on should we welcome or note the report. It's not the verb that makes a difference. It's like talking about, do I believe in science? It's not a verb which matters. The question is, what do we do with the information? How do we use it? How do we take it on board? Wondering about words is a very, as I say, it's this legalistic fascination we have. And yet the verb doesn't change what will happen on the Earth system. That's about how do we take that information, how do we use it. What we eventually decided was that we would consider further, get better understanding and feedback to the scientific community as particularly the IPCC preparing its 6th assessment report, but also for us as a policy community when we're working on the implementation of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. And I'll be taking that forward in the next meeting of SUBSTA in June. But I was also struck when I organized a special event in Katowice with the IPCC on the special report on 1.5 degrees by a remark that the Working Group 3 community, particularly the social sciences and the economists, had not actually participated very much in that. Only about 1/3 of that community had really fed in. And quite a few of them felt it was almost the wrong question, 1.5 degrees. It's not possible, so why ask the question? And I think this is one of those points of disconnect. The policy community, this, public people taking decisions, politicians, senior officials. As I said, we often use the language of economics. And if the language of economics is telling us, well, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, it's just not possible, then it's very, very hard for the message coming through from the physical sciences about the reality of what the Earth is going through or will go through in the future to be the basis of our decision. On the other hand, if we take our decision on the basis of economics, it doesn't change the way that the physical sciences will happen and the way that the Earth system will evolve given the emissions that we're producing and the way that our organization is there. So I think what we need is to bring those together more strongly. And I think obviously this is a meeting very much of the geoscience community, but the ability to come together with other parts, particularly the social sciences, to bring messages in a language that the policymakers can use, I think is critical. So I have a few very quick messages to finish off. I think this dialogue, we must continue to deepen it continuously. That's obvious for me. As I said, I think there's a disconnect between the language of the social sciences, which is the one that most policymakers are following and using, and the messages coming from the hard sciences, the physical sciences. And yet that's where we need to be looking. It's a key test of are we on track? What are the changes we need to undertake? And I think there's a whole language issue there that we need to think about and find ways to developing that common mode of thinking for the 21st century. I haven't mentioned education. Clearly that is vital as we move forward. Of course, that's a long-term issue, changing people's thinking over time. But that is at the heart of change. I think the mobilization of youth in particular over the last year, in particular the messages put forward by Greta Thunberg and all the youth movements and the climate strikes, has been really critical in getting messages over. And I think there's a real opportunity there for that side to be heard. And that links to the mobilization of civil society, because this is always a triangular debate. The policy community, the scientific community, and civil society. And unless that is taking place, the message from civil society coming back to the policy community, the politicians, the senior officials, who will then react to move that on. And so we need that to be the key way forward. So there's some very general thoughts, I'm afraid, but I hope that kicks the discussion off. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So moving directly on to our second speaker, David Mayer. David is the head of unit for Knowledge for Policy, Concepts and Methods for the Joint Research Centre, in the which is the European Commission's in-house science service. David has held various positions since joining the European Commission in 1995 and the Joint Research Centre in 2011. Before his current role, he was head of the JRC's Knowledge Management Units, responsible for research and training on evidence for policy making and for managing geographic knowledge. Between 2011 and 2016, he was working on science advice to policy and foresight, in between which he was acting director for policy support coordination. And so just in case to say, if you haven't realized, we're going from the more, it's the responsibility of the scientists at the beginning of our presentations, and then we're going to get more and more down to maybe it's the responsibility of the policymakers and the more maybe slightly skeptical or risky viewpoints towards the end of our presentations. But without further ado, let's welcome David to give his presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm not an earth scientist. I'm not even a scientist, so please be gentle with me. And I try and give a perspective from the world of policy making. So the Joint Research Centre, just in case you don't know what we try and do, we are on the one hand a scientific organisation well connected with the scientific community, producing papers published in high-ranked journals, 1,000 agreements with scientific organisations across the world. But at the same time, we have a double life because we are inside the European Commission, the executive branch of the European Union, and that means we get to go to the policy meetings, we get to talk to our policy-making colleagues as peers and try and bring scientific evidence into the policy-making process. Also, rather uniquely, we bring together science from a huge number of disciplines, certainly all of your disciplines, but we also work for pretty much every single European Union policy doing something. So we have the ability to bring together science, but also to bring together different policy areas. This question is a bit of a strange one. I'd never really thought about this question of who is responsible. And it's maybe quite a revealing question because for me there is a prior question which perhaps you haven't asked yourself, which is, why should policy be informed or based by science? Who says that is the case? And to ask that question, which I sometimes worry scientists sort of take it for granted that policy should be based on science, that it's some sort of axiom or law of nature. Well, I think you need to wake up if you think that's the view and see it for what it is. Basing your policy, informing your policy through scientific evidence is a value. This is a normative, not a scientific question. And so the question of who is responsible for the pursuit of this value is the same as every other value question. It is the responsibility of people who hold this value. So if you hold the value of thinking that policy and politics should be informed by evidence, and I certainly do, because science is the best account we have of reality, and I think it'd be a good thing if the way we do our politics had some sort of connection with reality. But if you believe that, you have to fight for it and argue for it and champion it, because no one else is going to do that. And in particular, it's now very clear that there are plenty of people in the world who don't think policy needs to be particularly based upon evidence. They think, in fact, that science and scientific authority is a challenge to their ability to divine the will of the people. And therefore there are, in places not very far from here, strong political movements who are seeking to downgrade, to degrade the role of science and its voice to speak up in politics. And there are also plenty of people who think, in fact, holy books is a much better way to guide our politics and policy making. So if you believe that policy making should be informed by evidence, that is your value, and other values are out there competing for people's attention. So we all have to argue and champion the values we believe in. So if, and I think we probably all, if we've turned up at this event, we do share this value, what are we going to do about it? I think we have to start from a hard-headed view of why this is so incredibly difficult. I come from a policy background, and when I got into the business of trying to connect science and policy, I realized pretty soon that I could not imagine two worlds that are more different than the world of science and policy making. And let me try and just sketch out some of the reasons why these are two quite antithetical worlds. One very banal one: science is often quite driven by the desire for novelty. That's what gets your reputation boosted, it gets your papers published. Policy making and politics is not really interested in scientific novelty. They want to know what the state of the science is. Maybe the most important scientific fact is one that's been in the literature 45 or 50 years, but has not yet migrated into the policy world. So that's a challenge for the world of science, which is very much focused on novelty and new developments. Secondly, what I can see is there is a progressive tendency to fragment in science, to get into ever smaller subdisciplines. And many of the scientists I work with, what they really want to do is to drill down and go deeper down into the thing they're really interested in. But what policymakers need, they need interdisciplinary science. They need to join up across the disciplines between natural and social science, but also bring in the humanities. So some of the drivers in science are pulling exactly away from the place that science needs to go if it is to have impact on policy. Thirdly, there is a gross mismatch between supply and demand. The number of scientific papers out there and the demand in terms of the bandwidth of policymakers to read them is absolutely enormous. Although there is some hope here in that the bandwidth of policymakers for science telling them what the problems are is pretty tiny because they've already got so many problems on their desk. Their bandwidth for solutions to the problems is considerably higher. And there is this mismatch that science tends to push towards coming up with ever new problems and focus its attention a bit less on solution to these problems. And the last of the challenges is that science and policy are fundamentally different enterprises, and they're captured in the statement, more research is necessary, and the policy equivalent of that is something must be done. And that captures the essence of the challenge in philosophical terms, but also in timing terms. Science always can carry on and develop new knowledge. Policy making, sometimes a decision has to be taken even if the requisite knowledge is not there. And that's a challenge that is hard to bridge. So what do we do about it? Well, I think government does have some important responsibilities to fund organizations like the JRC, knowledge-broking institutions at the interface between science and policy. I think we also need to rethink the training of policymakers in equipping them to get the evidence they need to critically appraise it and then explain it to politicians. And that's something we're working on in the Commission, to train Commission policymakers. You need good processes in government, impact assessment, evaluation. And you also need incentives for policymakers, for scientists put into research programs to devote some of their time to thinking about policy. On the scientific side, I think if you receive any public money at all, I think you should see as some sort of moral obligation to have a basic understanding of what is the meaning of your work in a societal and policy context. I think there is also an obligation to engage with citizens and understand the values that may be triggered by the kind of questions you're looking at. And I think to be open and honest about the values and the interests that you have as a scientist. There's sometimes a view that science can be the view from nowhere. Well, some of the research we're doing shows that you can't simply bleed out the values we all have. So an objective truth is going to be very challenging to achieve. Instead, I think we have to take the approach of finding an intersubjective truth. So trying to find different values positions and see how they all come together. There's some practical things we're also trying to do for scientists. So if you're a university or a scientific body that has a vocation to try and have an impact on policy, we have produced a framework for the skills and capacities you need in that organization. We are also running training courses. We have a Science for Policy 101 for our own scientists, and my colleague Lena Top is going to be here tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, giving a 90-minute quick dive into what you need to know if you want to influence policy. So there we go. Some practical things certainly need to be done, but above all, you have to start back at this original question of why should policy be informed by or based by evidence? This is a value that we all share, and like any other value, it needs to be argued for, it needs to be championed, and it needs to be defended. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our third speaker is Casey White. So Casey has worked at the Director for Geoscience Policy at the Geological Society of America since 2011. In this position, she leads efforts to influence policy on behalf of 27,000 members. This includes writing and delivering testimonials, statements, and letters, developing congressional briefings and exhibits, and increasing the GSA's members' effective involvement in public policy. Prior to working at the GSA, Casey was a project director of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, so AAAS, and the director of public affairs for the Joint Oceanographic Institutions. She was also a co-editor of the 2001 IPCC report and was a lead author in the technical summary of that report. So Casey's going to give us more of a viewpoint from the US and the NGO stand in this debate. So welcome, Casey.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for including me on this panel. It's fascinating to hear the diverse viewpoints and commonalities between different nations and international discussions on the interface of science and policy. So I'm very pleased to bring a US perspective and one of a scientific society seeking to engage on science and policy. So I think I might be the pivot point on this panel, and I'll go ahead and start with my conclusion, and that is that I believe policymakers are the ones responsible for integrating science into their policy. And scientists have an important role in this process, but challenges exist on both the policy and the scientific side, which you've already heard from a couple of our speakers. And therefore, changes need to be made to bridge this divide. So let me expand a little bit. When I'm talking about policy, I'm mainly talking about policymakers as the US Congress, the legislative branch in the United States. And they do not have a defined mechanism for integrating science into decision-making. There was a body, the Office of Technology Assessment, that somewhat served this role, but it has not been funded for more than 25 years. Now, that isn't to say that policymakers don't have access to scientific information. There are a number of congressional support agencies, the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability Office, that can research and write reports on legislation and policy issues, including scientific ones at the request of members. Members of Congress also receive scientific information from a whole host of other sources, National Academy of Science reports, think tanks across all ideological spectrums, universities, scientific societies, national labs, national and international assessments. There's no shortage of information coming to Congress. And I think Rush Holt, who's a PhD physicist, who served as a member of Congress for 16 years, said this, and I think it sums up the situation in Congress really well, that we do not suffer from a lack of scientific knowledge here on Capitol Hill, but a lack of ability to glean the knowledge, engage the credibility, validity, and usefulness of the large amounts of information and advice received on a daily basis. I think when you look at Congress, you also think of it as one entity, but it's actually 535 different offices, 435 members of Congress and 100 senators, each with their own systems for evaluating science. Only about 5% of the members in this session of Congress have a scientific background, and I think the percentage is similar for congressional staff. There are programs to place PhD scientists in the office of members of Congress. GSA sponsors one of these, but there's only about 30 each year. So with 535 offices, there's very little scientific expertise on Capitol Hill. And these non-scientists are making decisions on a whole host of issues that really depend on the science, from climate change to energy to natural hazards in our worlds. I think it's important to remember that in our Congress, they have a dual responsibility, both to legislate and represent the people in their district. And so when they make decisions, and you heard a bit of this already from David, it's a value judgment. They take into account the importance of issues in the district, of the businesses in the district, the values there, the economics, what their constituents think. Science is just one piece of this. And I am hard-pressed to come up with any issues where science is the only issue on it. It is very much a value decision on how decisions are made. And I think often as scientists, we've operated under the deficit model. If policymakers only knew the latest science, they would act differently. And social science study after social science study shows that simply is not the case, that it's based on values. This dual role as legislators and representatives does give scientists a unique opportunity to engage. Members of Congress want to hear from people in their district, and scientists are no different. They are there to represent them and want to hear from them, so this is a great entree point for scientists. Scientists can build relationships to share their research, but also serve as that trusted voice to help the members sort through the information that is thrown at them on a daily basis. And this is really important. The Congressional Management Foundation just did a study. 97% of offices found that citizens are more influential than lobbyists and news editors when they contact them directly. So scientists and constituents really do have a voice that matters, and I've seen this firsthand. I have a colleague who would visit his member of Congress when he was in Washington for other meetings several times a year. And when a bill to cut geoscience research was in a committee, the member of Congress called him, spoke to him at length, and then quoted him in her remarks opposing the bill. Those relationships really do value. So the challenges in the policy community exist, but there are plenty of challenges within the scientific community to engaging as well. Most scientists don't have the background or tools to engage in policy. And there are vastly different communication styles. Paul mentioned some of the language issues, and it's also the matter of communicating with someone who is not a scientist, who is usually a mile wide and inch deep, and in addition to science, also covers issues such as agriculture or veterans affairs, energy and transportation, for example. Scientists need to be able to make their research applicable to this and understandable in a very direct way, which is just not the way that scientific communication is usually done. The language itself is often very different. There's a number of terms that scientists use that are either unknown to policymakers and the general public, or I think in this case even worse, have meanings that are very different to both. The word enhance is one, enhanced greenhouse gas effect. To scientists, that's not a good thing. But to those outside the community, enhance is great. The same thing with positive feedback. Oh, it's positive, it must be good. So really being aware of the differences in language between the two communities is important. And finally, I think there's a big constraint on scientists with the academic reward structure. Communication with the public or policymakers is often not valued in the quest for tenure. Grants and publications are what are valued, and this research is either done in one's spare time as something extra in your free time or not at all. And I think that is a real hindrance to scientists trying to engage. So at GSA, we're trying to bridge this divide. We try to keep our scientists informed and provide them opportunities to come to Washington, D.C., to learn about the current policy issues and directly engage and start to build those relationships. We also work directly with members of Congress. We take our position statements, which represent the views of all of our members, as an authoritative source on scientific issues from water resources to natural hazards to climate change. We conduct briefings, submit testimony, and write letters, as Sarah said. And we're also working to change the culture. I think this is an important aspect not only for policy engagement, but for engagement the scientific community outside with the rest of society. GSA has a position statement rewarding professional contributions in the public spheres that calls on scientists to engage in policy and calls on the academic community to start to recognize these important contributions as well. So in conclusion, we're part of a culture change that is needed to help scientists better engage in policy so that policymakers can consider the best available science when they make their decisions, recognizing that many other factors come into play as they make their decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. So moving now on to our penultimate speaker, we have Günther Blöschel, who is the head of Institute of Hydraulic Engineering and Engineering Hydrology at the Vienna University of Technology. After working as an assistant professor at the Vienna University of Technology and holding research fellow positions in Vancouver, Canberra, and Melbourne, he obtained his senior doctorate in hydrology in 1997. In 2007, he was appointed Chair of Hydrology and Water Resource Management at the Vienna University of Technology. Günther has served as President of the EGU from 2013 to 2015. After being President of the EGU's Hydrological Sciences Division, he has received numerous awards, including this year's EGU's John Dalton Medal, so congratulations. And he has always been a strong advocate for bridging the gap between the fundamental understandings and the practices of water resources management. So welcome, Günther.
Presentation.
Yeah.
Good morning. I've been asked by Sarah to make a decision on which side of these two options she gave us we fall, whether the scientists should take on more responsibilities or the policymakers. So in the real world, of course, the real world is not black and white, it's always shades of gray, but for the purpose of this debate, I've decided to go for the second one. So it's the policymakers' decision to become more active. And my experience is mainly based on advising policymakers in the area of flood management. By way of introduction, I would like to point you to other activities in the interfaces of policy and science. Of course, this is not the first debate on the subject. And one very interesting activity is called Making Sense of Science under conditions of complexity and uncertainty, and this is the website and very interesting documents. One of the statements in these documents there says, policies are not only based on scientific advice, but indeed on many other factors that often are much more important. It's very important to have a trustful relationship between scientists and policymakers. And there are different roles for scientists and policymakers. Scientists, they should research the likely consequences of potential decisions rather than making the decisions, while the policymakers, they are elected representative of the public, so they should decide on the desirability of the consequences. Okay, now these are the ideas of my own. They are not part of this EU documentation. I would like to liken the relationship between scientists and policymakers with the relationship between businesses and consumers. So on the left-hand side, there are the businesses, on the right-hand side, the consumer, and there is an exchange of things. The businesses produce goods or services, and the consumers pay for them. And who is leading this relationship? There are different models. There's the business-to-consumer model, where the business leads the relationship, or the alternative, the consumer-to-business model, where the consumers are the more active of the two. And what is important to notice here is there are very clear incentives on both sides. The incentives of the business is to make money, and the incentive of the consumer to get a service or a product. The businesses would often advertise, and often is that unwanted by the consumers. And there's also all kinds of models and strategies of this customer or consumer relationship management. Now, this relationship is very clear, and if we liken this to the scientist-policymaker relationship, then David Mayer has been saying that we scientists should hold the value that policies should be informed by science. So this, to translate this in this, into this model, it would mean McDonald's holds the value that each kid should have their daily hamburger. But this is not the way it works. Their incentives are more direct. So this is the scientist-policymaker relationship where these incentives are less direct. They are less clear because there are usually no direct payments, and there are no direct products that are being sold. And also, the scientist's main business is usually not supporting policy making, about making science. My contract with my employer does not state that part of my responsibilities is to support policies. It says my responsibility is to make science and teach. So why would the scientists bother? David Mayer has been saying, why should policy be informed by science, indeed, and why should scientists bother about supporting policy making? As the funding of the sciences is often not related to policy support, and I believe actually that scientists should not be issue advocates, because this is the elected representative that should advocate the issues, not the scientists. We are not elected representatives. We wear two hats, one as a citizen, obviously, where we can voice our opinion, but the other hat as a scientist, which are two different hats. But we should rather act as honest brokers, and that desirability of decision consequences or the decisions are up to the policy makers. An example from policy support from my own work. This is a case study of flood risk management at the Inn in Tyrol. It's in the western part of Austria, the mountainous area. And there have been lots of floods recently with a lot of damage and people being unhappy. And now there's the question, where should we retain the flood waters? So where should we build reservoirs to hold back the flood waters to reduce the flood damage? And should we build the reservoirs close to the main stream where it's populated and where the floods occur? Or should we build the reservoirs further up in the mountains where nobody is living? It would be much more convenient for the people living at the Inn Valley, along the Inn Valley. And my group has been approached by the policymakers in Tyrol, and they asked for a study, and they paid a lot of money, and we did that, and we did analysis. And then one of the results, or the result of this study was, it's much more expensive to build the reservoirs up in the mountains than to build the reservoirs in the flatlands, in the valley. 10 times as expensive. But we were not issue advocates, but I'm not saying it's better to build them there, just more expensive, that's a fact. But we're not issue advocates. We try to be honest brokers. I would like to show 2 slides regarding 2 timescales, because I believe in the policy scientist interaction, timescales matter a lot. For example, timescales, 2 timescales, one of the policy making relative to the timescales of scientists. Also, David has been saying before, more research is necessary, that's the view of the scientists, but something must be done, the view of the policymakers. That's very often true. This has a lot to do with the timescales, because scientists think along longer timescales than policymakers that usually think in 4-year electoral terms. And this slide is to illustrate that depending on when we would like to meet a target, whether it would be 2030 or 2050, the decisions can be quite different, which has to do with the legacy risks. Where do I allocate the costs? Where do I allocate the benefits on the time axis? In terms of the legacy risk, what I mean by that is policy outcomes that may be close to irreversible with negative consequences, like a mining site. It would be very expensive to rehabilitate mining sites, or nuclear waste repositories. That's what we call legacy risks. And there's a lot to do with the uncertainty, decision-making under uncertainty. And these 2 graphs show that we have conceptually 2 possibilities to constrain the possibility space of future generations, that is the possibility of decisions, which is the top graph. So we can make decisions, for example, build nuclear power plants. Then the possibility space of future generations is limited, it's narrowed down, or leave the possibility space further wider for the future generations. So it's one way of dealing with uncertainty, which has to do with the precautionary principle, actually. Okay, so my last slide, I find there are lots of similarities between scientists and policymakers, relationships and the business-consumer relationships. Of course, a 2-way communication and knowledge co-production is needed, but that's not allowed in this binary world we are talking about today. So my view is that policymakers are responsible for more strongly incentivizing scientists and being more transparent with how they use science. So this triangle of the general public, scientists, and policymakers. Paul Watkinson has been talking about, yes, I think this is an important view to look at this triangle of these three entities, but their roles are very different. They don't have the same roles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Günther. Okay, so now on to our final speaker, which is Detlev van Vuren. So Detlev is a professor of integrated assessment of global environmental change at the Faculty of Geosciences in Utrecht University, and he's also senior researcher at the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, leading the Image Integrated Assessment Modeling team. He is listed among the most highly cited researchers worldwide and has published more than 300 articles. Detlev has participated in scientific assessments, including the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the UN Environment's Global Environmental Outlook, as well as the OECD's Environmental Outlook and multiple IPCC assessments. In addition, he is a member of scientific boards of several DG research projects, so showing a substantial experience in the science policy interface. So welcome, Detlev.
So being the fifth speaker after very good presentations means that a lot of things have already been said. And I hope I can still add something. So we are talking about the science policy dialogue. And already earlier we emphasized that there are different roles and different communication in each of these areas of science and of policymaking. In science, obviously, we value the reproducible experiment. We would like to make things small so that they can be researched. While on the other hand, for policy making, it's more or less the opposite. Questions are broad, they are of a what-if nature, and therefore are not very controllable. But I think one of the reasons we are here today is that we might think that some of these dialogues are not going well. Just to give you the idea here, so take IPCC. IPCC has now, over the last few decades, been publishing information on climate change, showing that climate change could lead to quite strong consequences, certainly with temperature above 2 degrees, and that if you would like to reach targets like Paris Agreement, emissions need to be reduced drastically. At the same time, if we look at the trends in emissions, we see that emissions are continuously going up still. And certainly, again, last year, for instance, emissions have risen by more than 2 or 3%. And so clearly, apparently this information from science is not leading to a change in society. And one might question, does it mean that scientists need to speak more, maybe have to speak louder, or have to speak clearer? Now, in a book recently published by Naomi Restes, the world actually went, it's a fiction novel, science fiction, and the world goes through dangerous climate change. And here in this book, she actually indicates that this is partly due to the attitude of reticence and reductionism of the scientist. This view is also really not new. In 1989, Steve Snyder was asked in an interview how he looked at the science policy dialogue. And this quote is actually often found at the internet, but then not the full quote as published here, but only the black part. And what Steve Snyder was asked is, how do you see this dialogue, and how do you see the importance of small communication? And he was answering that as scientists we are ethically bound to the scientific method, but at the same time, as scientists, we are also human beings. And as human beings, we have an interpretation of the knowledge we see, and we would like possibly to reduce the risk of potentially disastrous climate change. So if we feel that we are unheard, then at some point it obviously becomes very attractive to speak in a way that you might be heard. And that might mean that you want to engage yourself into getting more media coverage, which means that you have to simplify to make your statements more dramatic and possibly mention less of the doubts you might have. He continues then to say, this is a very difficult situation, and at the same time we have to find the right balance here. And I hope that means being both true to science and to the role of being part of the debate. For him, this was actually an emphasis on the science side. But as I said, this is often now quoted by climate skeptics without the blue font to emphasize that climate scientists are actually overemphasizing climate change. So just to show how values play a big role in this debate. And specifically in climate change, there is a lot at stake. We have different values with respect to ambition and solutions. For instance, with respect to solution, almost everything has something related to power, nuclear, wind power, or bioenergy. And uncertainty also plays a big role. So we have uncertainty in the climate system. We have uncertainty with respect to technology development and impacts. Now, if we take these words, uncertainty and values, they actually also play a big role in a book published by Pielke, where he tried to explain how he looked at the science policy dialogue. And he indicated that if there is a large uncertainty and if there is this consensus on values and beliefs, we don't have to look at the left part of the picture, but we have to look at the right part. And so in that situation, a scientist has basically two choices. On the one hand, he could promote a single preferred solution, or he could be trying to not do so. Now, if he does so, according to Pielke, that's actually a very acceptable role for a scientist. But then in that case, please be very clear that you're doing so. We come out with a statement that you're presenting a certain view, and then you're obviously allowed to present that, which would make you an issue advocate. However, he would say that a much more important role for a scientist would be to be the honest broker. And this was already emphasized earlier by Günther. An honest broker role is quite difficult. What does it require? It requires that we should be impartial, informative, and policy relevant, which means be aware of worldviews and the diversity of values and beliefs, provide insight into the different policy options, trade-offs, and opportunities, and be policy relevant, so answer the what-if questions that policymakers are asking us. IPCC is clearly an organization that tries to have this honest broker role. If you start as an author, the first thing that the chairs confront you with is you have to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And I think we can't undervalue the importance of organizations like IPCC at the moment, trying to be impartial in a world that is at the moment quite polarized. And the moment that we need a Republican and a Democrat IPCC or other parties, this organization is not providing the value anymore that it's currently presenting. So it needs to be relevant for all parties. At the same time, and this is on the downside, it often is put at the position of an arbiter. It is attractive for policymakers to somehow reduce the risk of making choices and therefore claim that an organization could help them making that decision. And that's difficult. A small error can easily lead to distrust. In 2008, we found a very small error in one of the IPCC reports about a statement on sea level rise in the Netherlands. where it was stated that 60% of the Netherlands would be flooded, while this turned out to be 30%. This was on page 400 something or something. Still, it really started a huge debate on the trustability of the IPCC, just to show how easily this kind of organizations can be damaged. Having said and having emphasized how important it is to stay impartial, Naomi Oreskes published an article a few years ago in Climatic Change, where she argued that the other danger would then be to stay erring on the side of the least drama, so really trying to be not taking any risk, which would be another possible risk for IPCC. So I would like to go to my last slide. I have so far emphasized on, is it important to start speaking louder? But maybe the word is start speaking clearer. So this sentence, scenarios reaching these concentrations by 2100 are characterized by 40 to 70% lower greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 and emission levels near zero in 2100, is from the last IPCC report and has been partly written by me. I originally wrote the science sentence and then was negotiating during the final plenary on a sentence that would go into the SPM. I thought it was a nice sentence. It emphasized the ambition that was needed if you want to go to 2 degrees. Now, first of all, when I started later on to discuss this with policymakers, the first interpretation was that 40 to 70% is normally read as 40% emission reduction. But then the second interpretation is that if that 40% to 70% is there, it's normally read as an uncertainty statement. In reality, it was not true. This 40 to 70% depends on the amount of negative emissions you have in the second half of the century. And this turned out to be an enormous important discussion now in policymaking. How much negative emissions do we like to have? And so in reality, I should have said 40 to 60% emission reduction with negative emissions, more than 60%, 60 to 70% if we want to avoid negative emissions. So while I was originally proud of this sentence, I later on realized how easily it could be leading to the wrong discussions in policymaking. I just wanted to show this as an example of clearer communications. I'm not sure that this can be avoided, but getting more aware of policy relevance is important. So, involved science is urgently needed, but it needs to be impartial. Speaking louder cannot replace a lack in political leadership. So each has its own role, and scientists should not step into the role that is there for policymakers. However, speaking clear is quite important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Detlev. So thank you to all the speakers. That ends the beginning of the first part of this session where we had presentations from the speakers. We're now going to go into more of a panel discussion and then ask for some questions from the floor, from the audience. Okay, so to try and summarize some of the key themes that I feel that have been coming out on the presentations, I think at the beginning we were seeing these presentations that were really showing the different mechanisms that already exist for people to get involved, for scientists to get involved in policy. But there was also there's a key theme coming out about the different values and how we use these values to base our decisions. And these can be very different if you're a policymaker or a scientist. I thought Paul's point was really interesting about if you really value science and you think that science needs to help policy, then you need to actively go out and do it. It's almost like a moral duty of the scientists to do that. But then with the later presentations, we were discussing more about, well, the incentives. We need to have more incentives. It was very interesting to hear about the differences as well between the two worlds, where we have differences in language that was mentioned a couple of times in the speakers, differences in maybe priorities, differences with the economics versus the physical sciences, and the point that, well, if we, and also the differences in the time frames. So maybe economics for a shorter time frame for a policymaker is more beneficial, but then, as David said, that the physical sciences is still there. So you base it on economics, but the Earth system will still respond. And I thought that was a very interesting point. So there was a couple of comments on how we can have these sort of interactive dialogues to come across and understand our shared values. And there was talks about the barriers to that, but I'd like to put it to the panel of, rather than more than a debate, but thinking more about a constructive way forward. How do you feel, what kind of mechanisms do you think could come across to really enhance these interactive dialogues more? What kind of ways do you think policymakers and scientists on both sides could get together and help produce science-based policy? I didn't know if anyone wanted to start off, and then after maybe a round of comments, we can open it up to the floor. So I see David putting his hand up. I think these mics will work, so you can just speak from there.
Thanks, yes, for picking up on the values point. I think one of the basic reasons why this is such a difficult field is because neither science nor policy necessarily needs each other. Science doesn't actually need for its outputs to be used. Science just needs to produce more knowledge, and there is no functional necessity for that to be taken up in policy. And likewise, policy doesn't necessarily need science. Politics is by definition, is taking decisions under imperfect conditions of uncertainty. So decisions will have to be taken. So we have this dreadful challenge where neither side absolutely needs each other. And the business, what we're trying to do is to bring these magnets which are repelling each other together, because both science and policy will be better done if we can define a way of making them work together. And fundamentally, why they don't need each other is in philosophy the is-ought problem. Science can tell us the way things are. It doesn't necessarily give us any clue as to the way things should be. In other words, the distinction between the analytical and the normative. And that, I think, gives a clue for how to improve the nature of the dialogue. We are doing some research at the moment trying to understand what drives our political behavior. Why don't the facts speak for themselves? Why do people of certain political persuasions simply not recognize the science? The good news is there is fantastic new science coming out of neuroscience, cognitive linguistics, psychology, which is beginning to explain our political behavior. So our Enlightenment 2.0 project will give us some clues. And one of the most important findings is that our political behavior is driven by our values, which are quite deeply set in our psychology. They appear to be based to our personality type, which appears to have some sort of genetic or early development link, so they're pretty hardwired. But not only do our values guide our political instincts and behavior, they actually shape how we see science and objective truth and facts. We don't see the world straight. We see it through the lenses of our personalities and our underlying values. So the lesson of all of this is that if you want your science to have an influence on people, you need to understand their values, because you can't simply reason and argue people out of their values. And the blunt truth is that if you're a scientist drawn to this sort of work, you probably have a certain personality type which probably gives you a certain framing of values which are not universal values. To see the world as a complex place with all sorts of different competing demands is actually tuned into a certain set of political values. So the basis of getting this right is understanding that, as in everything about human nature, you are not normal. We go around thinking, I'm normal. It's called in psychology naive realism, and believing everyone else is out like you. They're not, and when it comes to these sorts of issues, scientists on the whole do not necessarily have within themselves instinctively the value set of everyone in society. So we have to work much harder to understand the value sets of people who don't necessarily naturally agree with this science, and then find ways to frame and communicate the science honestly and ethically, but in ways which is tuned in and resonates with the values that they hold, because those are the fundamental drivers that will affect not only how they see the world, but also what they decide to do about it.
I think Gunther wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. In response to your statement, this is a debate. You were saying that science does not give us normative solutions. I would disagree with that. In geoscience, we can do a lot about normative solutions, about predictions and what is optimum from an economic perspective, but not in the presence of uncertainty. So this is where the lack of the ability of providing normative solution comes in. And I believe actually what you call value, a natural scientist would call uncertainty. So they're the flip side of the same coin, uncertainty and values. One point. Second point, in response what you've been asking, who should start? Who should be more active, proactive in the policymaker-science interface? And I think that the activities should follow the incentives. So who has a stronger incentive for the interaction to work? Policy doesn't need science, and science, if policy doesn't need science, why should they bother? So the activities should follow the incentives, and actually they usually do follow incentives. So if we want to, for the interface to work, either if policy is more interested in strengthening and furthering the relationship, they would have to provide incentives. And vice versa. If we as scientists would like to, for the interface to work better, we would have to provide incentives to the policymakers. Thank you.
Would anyone like to follow up on the incentives comment? Anyone from the panel? No? No incentives. Okay. So I think at this stage, I'll open it up to the audience. If anyone has any comments, or questions, any questions, can you please come up to the microphones in the middle and introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Okay, I'm Matthias, capture from GFZ in Potsdam. And something that I found interesting is that we're just talking about scientists and politics, or politicians, which are 1% and another 1%. And there are another 98% that are the local public, or the public in general. And I think it would be much more important and efficient for scientists to talk to the general public. Because if the public does not trust science, politicians won't care. Because politicians care about being re-voted and about getting money in the end, as we do as well, but that doesn't matter. So isn't it more efficient and more important to talk to the public and get them involved? And yeah, what's your opinions on that?
Would anyone else, someone like to try start with that? Casey.
I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think encouraging scientists to communicate outside of academia at large is a really important part of the culture change that needs to happen. And I think as scientists communicate with the public too, that gives additional messengers. I think we're hearing a lot about values, and I think in some cases scientists might not be the best messengers. So working with other partners to communicate the science that we have might be an important effect politically. But going straight to the decision makers does have a big influence. And I think reaching the public is a very large, very long-term issue. Education is a large part of that, and there is not one general public to do. But I think both are very important.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to be taken forward in this. The public is essential. because it's the public which ultimately votes for its decision makers. The way in which we as citizens engage is absolutely vital for this to be taken forward, including scientists as citizens as well. And I think this way in which people engage, I think Detlef's point in his presentation about advocates or honest brokers, we do need people who provide us with the clear information. But we also need the people who will push this forward as policy choices. And I think having more scientists coming into the political world would actually help us to have some of that side as well. But I think it does have to come to the public. I think clear communication of the scientific community is essential. I think the IPCC, in putting forward the special report on 1.5 degrees, made a much improved effort in communication. I'm not saying it hadn't been done before, but I think it was coming to simple messages about every 0.5 degree counting, every year counting, every action counting, and then that has to be declined into more detail that people understand. And I think the other actors who have to be intermediaries here, clearly journalists and the press, and the media more generally, are a vital player in this field. How do we engage those? And I think the scientific community engaging with the media is also part of this, because they, in the end, fix the agenda to a huge degree. If you only get 30 seconds to get a message over, then how do you get that message over? And sadly, that is a great deal of this. And again, the communication in that field matters. So it is complex. There isn't a simple answer, but I think the public is at the heart of this, because if the public's not engaged, then in the end it will be a sterile debate.
David?
And just one point that is often forgotten, but comes out pretty clearly about the research, that it is not just the nature of the message you're passing, its clarity, and all these other things. At a subconscious level, we take messages and believe them an awful lot depending upon who is giving the messenger. And one of the huge problems we face is that scientists look like an elite, and they don't look like ordinary people. And therefore the message will not pass unless people who are passing the message in some sense seem like one of us to the people who are resisting this message. So that is, I think, quite a deep and quite fundamental challenge. That at the moment we're on a very dangerous path where people see no real difference between a political elite, a technocratic elite, and a scientific elite. And it's all these people telling me things which are why I'm going to be able to travel less or have less employment or whatever. So until we actually think about who are the messengers as well, I think we're going to have many challenges.
So I can see a few hands up. Can you maybe come to the microphones, and then I can see who wants to speak? Yeah, so you first.
Hello, my name's Andrew Scott from Royal Holloway, University of London. My interest in wildfire. And I have a problem at the moment discussing with politicians about wildfire, because you go to one of our politicians and they, for example, don't know who to discuss in government. It's actually wildfire is the responsibility of 5 different ministries, and in one ministry under 5 different junior ministers, none of which know that each other has any responsibility. And so it's not a matter of just communicating with politicians, it's actually developing structures within government, within our civil service, where actually you can get the science and express the problems to those different people. Because even if a politician wants to develop something, they don't know who to speak to. So, you know, particularly in my particular constituency, my MP happens to be in the government, you know, very high up in the government. But when I went to speak to him about an issue which relates to our own constituency relating to fire, he had no idea who in government to speak to. So you have this problem. It's not just a matter of communicating to the politicians, it's also developing structures within government, because I gave evidence to Parliament, and the person who was chairing it, at that very moment we were giving evidence, there was a fire in his own constituency, but he thought it was the responsibility of the fire brigade in terms of even policy. He hadn't realised that actually it was a matter of the Home Office, but actually there were different ministers within the Home Office who had responsibility. So there's no communication. So it isn't simply a matter of policymakers and politicians. It's developing structures within civil service to allow those discussions to take place in a better system.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that we had in one of the presentations talking about the interdisciplinary nature of science and how that really helps with policymakers to understand. But maybe we need a more interdisciplinary structure within the governments and the ministries to help communicate that science better. I'd like to take another question from the lady who's standing up there, and then we can go to the panel for some comments.
Mm-hmm. My name is Catherine Benningman. I work for an insurer, Allianz. I'm a scientist there, and I was curious how you view the interaction between policy, science, and also risk transfer opportunities. For example, we talk a lot about natural hazards here at the conference also.
Is there one other quick question that someone might want to ask before we ask the panel something else? Yeah, please come up.
Yes, hello. My name is Lucas Lusch, and I'm a researcher here in Vienna at the Boca University, and thank you for the interesting debate to get different viewpoints from policymakers and scientists. I would like to follow up on a comment made earlier and also on an issue Paul Watkinson and David Mayer raised about this triangular debate with policy, science, and civil society. And I would like to hear what we could learn maybe from France and the unrest with the West John, Mr. Watkinson, because it was initiated actually by a policy response also to a demand, which was initiated by scientists also to increase the taxes on gasoline and so forth. And of course, that was one of the triggers for the social unrest. And maybe you could follow up on what we can learn from this example about the whole science-policy interface. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to jump from the panel to address any of those?
I'll start with the insurance question because I think it's a good illustration of something that keeps coming up, and that is the value of other messengers. At least in the United States, the insurance agency has been very valuable in communicating uncertainty and really showing the risk of climate change. So working with the scientific community, there are very clear economic effects on the insurance agency, and it is one area that's very clearly affected by climate change. And I think that voice has made a big difference in climate discussions in the US. So showing partnerships with scientists, not just with the political structure, but also with the public and with other institutions to push forward the science.
I have a brief comment regarding uncertainties. And the question is whether we should exaggerate to be better heard in the presence of uncertainty. I believe if we liken, another comparison, if we liken our activities with that of medical doctors, and you press them how long it will take until you get better again, or whether you will die, they will never tell you. The best they can do, and they usually don't, is to give you a probability, however you press them. But we somehow, for whatever reason, we feel concerned that we need to give a definite answer. But sometimes there is no definite answer. And I think we should be honest and strong enough to be able to say perhaps a probability, but not a binary black and white answer if it is not clear. Thank you.
Detlef and then Paul.
So there has been clearly a theme about communication to the wider public beyond the policymakers. Also in relation to the unrest. I think, obviously, we're living in a polarized world at the moment, and somehow we need to try to find ways to still communicate to both policymakers and the public at large. And I think it's not something that's easy, but maybe there are a few things that are important in that. And one is clearly transparency. So more than ever, people can want to know what's behind and can actually use the internet to look at what is behind your statements. And so increasingly making things transparent, open access, I think it will be an increasing theme to deal with this. The second thing is in communication, and just giving an example from the IPCC. The tendency with the IPCC reports trying to summarize thousands and thousands of papers is to make everything, to synthesize everything into extremely complicated figures and sentences. We are learning that it doesn't always work. And so in the AR5, for instance, there were many graphs with many lines where we were showing all the scenarios that were possible. In the 1.5 degree report, the authors of that report decided to do it differently and take 4 caricatural scenarios that showed the essence of the discussion instead of trying to summarize the whole literature. And I think that might also sometimes be a way forward, not to synthesize but to select, and to select those parts of the literature that are relevant for the current debate. So those are the 2 things. The third, by the way, is that there are schemes that can help us to be aware of our own value judgments. There is, for instance, things like the cultural theory, or there are other schemes where we can look at the different topics and see it from different value perspective glasses. And doing so as a scientist and try to look at the same problem, but then from a different value perspective, helps us pretty much to be communicating in a way that is potentially not biased by our own normative statements, but potentially speaking to a wider audience.
Paul.
Yeah, if I can pick up a few of those points, including the last question. First, maybe one reaction to the issue of risk and insurance. And I think in preparing climate policies, the role of the insurance sector has been very important in putting this on the agenda, engaging with government and working more broadly. And the whole issue of risk also coming more into a wider engagement of the financial community has been a key part of our work in the last few years, of bringing these actors on board. Again, the interaction between the two, that and developing good policies, is vital. And there are many players who've been part of that debate engaging. And again, it's a complexity of this landscape and the number of actors that I'd underline there. In terms of the final question and civil society, and then where there are essentially contradictory impacts as we try to implement policies, and then we find that people push back on them. I mean, this is an area going well beyond, I think, the scope of the debate as I saw it originally. But I think it's one we need to get into. Quite often there are not simple answers. Again, you can't simply say this is the solution and take it forward. You also need to accompany the solutions of transition, particularly the deep transition we need in our economies to move away from a fossil fuel-based economy, but also the way in which we organize our lives, the question of mobility, the question of the organization of our cities. That's a deep transition which can only be handled over time. And unfortunately, transitions often involve people who feel they're losing. I think some of this also fits into the debate on values that we've been having as well. At that stage, simple solutions can quite often produce very complex and sometimes negative reactions and pushback. One, that pushes us to develop policies which then also have to be about accompanying and dealing with change, managing change. Again, we need to work with the scientific communities that can provide us examples, share experience in this field, dealing with transition in a just way, and thinking about how that can be handled. It's also about involving people in the decisions on their own lives. When choices are imposed, they are much harder to, you don't get the buy-in which is needed. And again, it comes down to some of the exchanges we were having earlier about an expert coming from outside providing the answer. Doesn't always have people's trust. How do we ensure that people feel they've been listened to, including in that learning process? That says a lot about the nature of our democracy, in all of our countries and at a local level. In France, we've engaged a grand débat over the past few months. We'll have the synthesis today. I'm not going to anticipate how that will be taken forward or whether it's necessarily the right solution. But I think it says something about the way we need to be thinking, particularly in a world where we're so much more interconnected and we all have a way of getting our views over. And civil society is organizing itself in a more bottom-up way. How does that react into the decision-making processes as we move forward? And where's the role of expertise in there? Particularly when people are working on Facebook groups or whatever else, and there is no judgment on the value of expertise in that field. How can expertise still inform that process? And there is a risk, of course, of it being taken over by things which are not expertise-driven. Anyway, I'll stop there because it's taking us into a very, very different area, but an interesting one.
Thank you. Can I take another question from the audience? Can you please go up to the microphone and introduce yourself? Oh, we've got two.
Mine is quite a short question. So my name is Chloe Hill and I am the EGU Policy Officer. My question is, what role can scientific unions play? So, for example, the EGU. What role can we play in helping to bridge this gap between scientists and policymakers?
Good morning. My name is Martin Bohle. I'm an outgoing official of the European Commission, taking a second dive in science. So my starting point is to the question, if I have an insight, as scientist, it's me as a messenger the task to bring it forward. And when I look to the talks and to discussion, I see very much reflection about elements, what is the process at the science-society interface, who helps or makes understanding more difficult. And against that background, my question to the panel, if you would like to design a research undertaking, for example, picking up on Kovacs and Edenhofer's work out of the IPPC, what are the next questions to study, to research, in order to get the science-policy interface more active, so that we know what to do and not only know what we should not do? When I talk to my science projects in the past, when the project is ready and they are eager to present the results, that is very likely not the moment when the policymaker is ready to listen. So we have a dramatic mismatch there, one of the problems. So what's the research agenda for getting the science and policy interface better?
Thank you. So we're actually quite running short on time, so can I take the two remaining questions? Can they be very short? And then we'll go for a quick response from the panel. So the lady first and then the man at the back.
Now that Trump is elected and so on, there's increasing worry that politicians and the public don't even want to listen to science, and it's increasingly difficult maybe to even get people interested who prefer to listen to conspiracy theories or whatever. So what is your view on this?
Thank you. And the gentleman at the back.
Short contribution. Only scientists and policymakers not enough, because we need to citizens, or we are. Because if we make some policymakers without people, and then it will make a memorize effect. And memorize effect very dangerous. It's like a new religion or disgusting government. It's similar. And for example, for explaining to people, we must find good examples. For example, the refrigerators. If these are huge volume in our houses. If few grams decompose and all the refrigerator cold balance is collapsing. And for example, this is good example for the understanding the people. And all the people must learn how the world govern, not only governments or the politicians. This is a rule for everyone who lives in the world. Maybe we can teach the animals in the future. And
I think we're going to have to end it there. Sorry, but we're running out of time. Okay. So I'd like to get some responses from the panel, and then we can go back to the poll before we finish the session. So would anyone like to come forward on any of those questions? Günther.
I would like to answer to the question, what kind of research should we do in order to support policy in the long term? And I think in our research field is quite diverse. We have research at universities, we have research at large research centers, and the research centers I know, particularly within the Helmholtz Society, they have exactly that process. There is like a process between politics and the leaders of the research institution to outline what society would need in the next decades and break this down into smaller, more digestible research questions. So this process is happening at larger research institutions, not so much at universities, where the research questions are decided on by individual scientists. And I think it's good to have a mix of both. Thank you.
Yes, Dave?
So my suggestion for where more research is needed, I think we need to deepen our behavioral science research into understanding political behavior and how we think, how we talk, and how we take these decisions. We've started doing that, but by no means have we finished, because I think the model we currently have, the so-called deficit model, or the idea that the facts simply speak for themselves, is broken. So until we understand our human nature when it comes to these decisions and learn how to tailor our scientific communication, we are simply not going to persuade people by just banging away at yet more facts. My advice for people like the EGU, it's clear that one of the most important ways to make progress is to network science for policymaking. Policymakers need scientists from all over the place. So one of the crucial roles EGU and other scientific unions can do is to match up and connect scientists with the policymakers that they need to connect with. I think also there's potentially a role for training scientists in the EGU, giving them a sort of first steps in advising policymakers, and we in the JRC would certainly be prepared to help the EGU develop those sorts of skills.
Detlef.
So I was going in a quite similar direction as David. So first for the question about new science, I would like to answer that mostly also from the perspective of IPCC. So in climate change, we have focused pretty much on the physical science, why do we have to change, and then in working group 3, mostly on the economics and the technical. What kind of technologies do we have to change and what do they cost? There has been very, very little evidence of research so far on behavioral science, social science, psychology in IPCC. And I think that is increasingly needed. So even if we can show that costs are relatively low from a macro perspective, there are losers. There are people that need to be compensated, and finding out ways to implement measures with higher social support, I think is crucial if we want to make the step of implementing the Paris Agreement. And for the EGU, I actually had the same suggestions, so I can leave that.
Casey, a quick comment?
I just wanted to agree with the suggestions for EGU, but also add that I think scientific unions have the important role of really changing the culture so that engagement with the public and with policymakers is an expected part of what a scientist does. That it is not extra, that it is not frowned upon, it is not looked down upon, and giving the scientists the tools to do this in an effective way.
Yes, and also I think we're all going in a very similar way. I totally underline the importance of the behavioral side. I think this is critical, bringing in much more the wider social sciences into how we can make the transition we need on climate, but also how we link that to our decision making. And as I was arguing in my initial comments, the very language we use to frame it, I think is an essential part. We need to find a way, we haven't found it yet properly, that we can put those messages forward in a language which will link the world of the economists, the social scientists, and the physical scientists, so that decision makers can put things forward. Yes, there are values involved, but I think there are some ways we can work together to find that. And in terms of politicians who simply don't want to hear, and with other interests involved. I think that's where the voice of the scientific community just needs to be heard. It needs to make itself heard, and it needs to make clear there is a difference between uncertainty in the scientific sense and simple ignorance.
So if I can just abuse my position as facilitator, just on the point about what new research could be policy relevant and upcoming. From an IPCC perspective, we try in the reports to have a section in every chapter that says knowledge gaps or areas that we don't quite know about yet, which is normally very of topics that are policy relevant. And so I always think that if you go in and review the drafts, if you can be an expert reviewer and sign up and review the IPCC drafts, you can always look at those knowledge gap sections, maybe for a bit of inspiration for what areas of research might be coming up that we need to fill to be able to answer some key policy questions. So I'm going to go and look at the poll one more time and see and get you all to interact with that again. But just before, I'm going to put to the panel with some closing remarks after the poll. Feel free to give your 2 cents of what you'd like the audience to take home as their key messages. But if you could maybe incorporate maybe a recommendation for scientists of if they want to get more involved, what one action would you recommend them do to be more involved in the policy process? So I give you time to think about that, but we'll go to the poll now to see if anything has changed. So can you exit? Or maybe we won't. If you can still sign in and vote, I can look at the results afterwards and tweet it and tell you if it's changed. It'd be very valuable for us just to know if any opinions have changed through it. Sorry. But I think the internet is down, so. Okay. All right, so with that, I'll hand over to the panelists if anyone wants to give their closing remarks. Maybe we go from the order of the speakers, so Paul first.
Well, I think we've said almost as much as can be said. I think it's engaging in this debate and continuing and taking this forward.
So read a bit of behavioral science and read a bit of philosophy of science, because that provides some important clues as to the way forward. We are writing a report under this Enlightenment 2.0 project, summarizing the latest science in this sphere on exactly these questions, and that'll be out middle end of May. 2 points I'd pick out of that. First, trust. The psychologists tell us that if you want to be trusted, it is not only a question of scientific excellence. Scientists sometimes think that's enough. The science doesn't say that. The science says, yes, excellence or competence is important, but it also says that honesty is extremely important. So scientists need to be honest and open about their values and interests, but also a shared community of interests. So scientists who look and sound like you is incredibly important for being trustworthy. And secondly, this point of framing. We've also mentioned values, and so I can't help but mention the advice of George Lakoff, one of the greatest cognitive linguists working in the area of framing and metaphors. His succinct message is always frame with values.
I would suggest there are abundance of resources already out there. You don't have to start from scratch. EGU has a number of resources on communication. As you've heard, there are a wealth of studies on communication, on the social science aspect of this that are really critical. It is out there. And as you start your engagement, I think I would encourage people to consider what is a science question and what is a policy question, and be very clear about those and where you want to engage.
I think it is important for us scientists to reflect what our roles are in the interactions with the general public and policymakers. And I believe the roles are not the same. And we should also be transparent in what are the incentives for us to engage in this initiative. In the same way as policymakers should be transparent in the way they use scientific evidence. Thank you.
Yeah, so I do think it's really important that we do get into this debate with policymakers. And if one incentive is the knowledge utilization paragraph in our proposals, maybe the more important incentive is simply that we want to be part of the decisions that are made that determine the future of our planet. Then if we do engage, I think it's very important to choose the type of role that we're playing. And I've shown earlier that it's okay to take a side only, but then only if you are very transparent about it. That's the role of the issue advocate. I think the other role, and that might be much more important, is the role of the honest broker. Honesty was just mentioned as a way to communicate. I think the honest broker is an essential role for science to play. And organizations like IPCC are trying to do so and cannot be undervalued.
Okay, so we've managed to get the internet to work so we can see. And I think it's even become more stronger to policymakers' responsibility, which is interesting. I should work for the next one. Interesting, there's a lack of mechanisms when the speakers in the panel have just said that there are mechanisms out there, so maybe we need to research into what they are. So I guess it's just left to me to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to the panel for giving such great presentations. Can we just give a round of applause to say thank you to the panel again?